Welcome. In this workshop, we are discussing the drivers of professional behavior model. This model is a very powerful assessment and training tool used to help managers, directors, and other decision makers understand the forces behind their key staff's professional behavior, both individually and collectively. The model also serves to aid in helping the manager or decision makers to better understand his or her own professional behavior and how it affects their subordinates' behavior in the staff culture generally. So why is this model beneficial? How does it help you? Well, there's a very clear operational risk paradigm, which on one hand we have the prevention model, we have the prevention effort, and on the other hand, the response. Certainly, preventing negatively impactful events by proactively managing operational risk and risk factors is the way to go. That's what we want to do. It's more cost effective. It's more responsible business management. As soon as we go into the realm of response, as soon as we have allowed or otherwise a negatively impactful event has occurred and we're in response mode, costs escalate and potential liabilities escalate by orders of magnitude. So we want to prevent those things as much as possible. This entire module is primarily focused on prevention. Again, coming from an expeditionary background, we couldn't afford to have something happen out in the backcountry somewhere that wasn't planned for. You know, on the market landscape, if there's a negatively impactful event, there's an incident or accident, many of those things can be dealt with by throwing more money at it, more time at it, starting over again, hiring somebody, firing somebody. But in the backcountry, on an expedition, those events can literally be tragic. They can literally mean that someone may be critically injured or may die. So the level to which we need to consider operational risk to responsibly manage expeditions is to a much greater degree, I would submit, than almost any other business model. And we're able then to conform those models to the market landscape as well. So again, getting back to the benefit is that this is a very powerful operational risk prevention model. The objectives are first to understand what motivates and demotivates people, human beings, within the workplace in an effort to design the best onboarding, developmental, and assessment processes and to create the highest level of staff engagement. Staff engagement, staff motivation, those are all things that are very good preventative risk management tools. Secondly, we want to understand how supervisory behavior and attitudes, either real or perceived by subordinates, affect the behavior of subordinates, the staff culture generally, and ultimately the company's success. So what does this have to do with operational risk management? Professional behavior is, I can almost say with certainty, that professional behavior is the single greatest subacute risk factor or root causal factor of negatively impactful events on the market landscape in the business world, same as in the expeditionary world. So it's important that the understanding of that behavior is managed because that's the most effective way to mitigate operational risks. But before getting too far down the road with this workshop specifically, or the module generally, I want to introduce some terms which I've already kind of used here, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with what I'm saying. I don't want to take for granted that we're all hearing and understanding this language the same way. So, first of all, within the context of this module, a risk factor or an acute risk is the most immediate, actual or potential causation of a negatively impactful event. On one hand, the actual causation is a risk factor. On the other hand, that potential causation is acute risk. So depending on how it's read, depending on context, they're kind of different sides of the same coin, so to speak. And we'll find the same thing with the next definition, talking about subacute risk factors or root causal factors. These as well can be interchangeable terms depending on context. And the definition for these terms is the most basic or realistically traceable and definable causation of an acute risk or risk factor. So these are the underlying factors that allowed for the more acute event. Risk itself, to define risk without really cornering ourselves in a really specific interpretation of risk, our operating definition of risk is interaction with uncertainty. So that doesn't necessarily imply that the interaction is negative or positive, or that uncertainty is negative or positive, but that those two things exist within the definition of risk. So we need to as best we can, identify the interaction, understand the interaction, control the interaction with the uncertainty. And by definition, uncertainty is somewhat unknowable. So we have to have plans in effect, in place, trained and assessed to manage the interaction. So moving on to our first slide here. This probably will look somewhat familiar to most of you, but it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but as applied to employee engagement. And I'm not going to break this model down very much. It's there for you to refer to, certainly should you need it. But what I want to point out, the most important aspect of this slide, so far as we're concerned, is that line between motivators and demotivators. You'll see those safety and survival needs, and then above them are those higher levels of engagement and motivators in the workplace. The important takeaway from this model, this slide, is that safety and survival needs are not motivators. Those are expected by the workforce. They're expected by an employee. They're expected by you of your employer to have a safe workplace, job security, a living wage, in line with whatever that market rate is for that type of work. Those are just baseline expected aspects of a job. They're not motivators. They will for a while, certainly, but we'll find out later when we talk about different types of motivators, intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivators, that these factors as motivators have a pretty defined short shelf life, and we can't depend on them to motivate our staff or engage the staff in any real way. But in any case, moving on with that knowledge in mind, we're going to look at our primary model here, the drivers of professional behavior model. And in this model, we're using a car as the vehicle, pun intended, to represent that key staff person as they move down the road of their professional experience. Number one being the engine. And the engine are those safety and security needs that we just covered. So I'm not going to go any further into that, except to say that going forward, we're just accepting and expecting and assuming that those safety and security needs are being met. But even if they are, a properly functioning engine attached to nothing doesn't work anyway. So we need to have something upon which to propel our staff down the road of their professional experience. So number two is the tires. And there are 4 tires, obviously. So there are 4 primary drivers of professional behavior. The first one is probably the most important, is power. And that's appropriate power, and that's expected power, meaning that whatever that person's scope of responsibility, their job description, the level of responsibility that they're supposed to have, or what their manager has told them that they are responsible for, to have power within that responsibility, to have power to manage that staff, those subordinates, and those departments, committees, objectives, what have you, without being micromanaged, and with having the autonomy and the power to affect those responsibilities. The second one is freedom, and it's somewhat tied into to power, freedom, autonomy, again, similarly, in an appropriate manner to operate within the scope of responsibility to meet objectives. It's freedom of choice to some extent, freedom of scheduling and the route toward meeting an objective, rather than being really narrowly confined to someone else's, a supervisor's concept of how things should be done. If the responsibility for determining how those things should be done fall within that subordinate's scope of responsibility, so we give them that freedom. The next one is belonging. And that's a very important one. We'll see that this, and most of these actually, are kind of running themes when we talk about the human side of the risk equation. Belonging, autonomy, power, these things are very important, again, to manage that human equation. It seems, especially with belonging, that just as human beings, we're hardwired to belong. And certainly within the workplace, that's no different. We want peer acceptance. We want recognition. There's a sense of a different kind of sense of achievement when you've achieved something together, when you've been part of something that you could not have done on your own. And the converse of that, you've been part of something that would not have been as successful if not for your input. And those are powerful drivers. Those experiences are powerful drivers of human behavior in the workforce, and they should be intentionally managed rather than just kind of organically expecting or letting them happen. We want to do that more intentionally. Then the last driver, number 4, is mastery, is achievement. We're primarily talking in this context of those key staff, high potential staff, high leverage staff, department heads, department leads, decision makers. They are pursuing the career they're pursuing because they have a self-identification wrapped around that. They've been doing it long enough or pursuing it hard enough that it's a very large part of their self-identity. It's not just what they do, but again, in some regard, who they are. And so for a sense of self-worth, there needs to be a sense of mastery or achievement about that self-definition. So again, that needs to be actively managed. You need to set these high leverage people up to experience mastery, to experience achievement, and then also recognize it. I would even go so far as to say that the entire structure of the business or enterprise is wrapped up in those high leverage employees achieving mastery. It's hand in glove that in order to reach the objectives and work toward the mission of the business model, that the people most responsible for leading and driving that mission and for managing those objectives are experiencing mastery of their position within the enterprise itself. And then I want to turn your attention to this question mark, referring to the people in the car. Who are these people? If this vehicle is meant to represent those high leverage key staff, as they, drive down their professional experience. Who's driving? Often when I ask this question, I'll get the response that if I'm this person's manager, I'm the director, I'm responsible for this person's production or output, then I'm driving the car. Which of course is not true. That employee is always driving. They are always making choices. They are always managing their own behavior or choosing to behave however they choose to behave on their own. They are driving. That response that I just mentioned, that response that suggests that the manager thinks that he or she is driving, typically comes from managers who aren't very successful, or who are young, who are inexperienced, who just haven't learned yet, or just who are not particularly good managers. They're insecure, they're whatever. They're trying to get their own power needs met, maybe, so they're, they want to be in that driver's seat. But astute, experienced, successful managers will know that at best, they might be in the back seat of that car and helping that staff person navigate down the road of their professional experience. But even to get there, to get into that seat, they need to have built rapport with that person. They will need to have built a level of trust with that person that high leverage staff has let them into the back seat and has proactively sought their aid with navigation. So not to be taken lightly, and also to be managed intentionally. And I guess before I go any farther, much of this information that I used to build this model comes from Dr. William Glasser. And I've used a lot of his terminology here. I've applied this for many, many years in the field, and I found it to be very useful on the business landscape as well. But in any case, the windshield in this model represents what Dr. Glasser calls the total knowledge filter. The total knowledge filter is everything that the employee brings from past experiences, from education, from personal experiences, from their cultural experiences, and the professional expectations formed by those experiences, or formed by that information that they've been told firsthand from managers, or what their job description says, whatever it may be. And with that filter, all of the information that hits that person, that hits that car, is then categorized into three very distinct categories. The first one is, this information matters to me. So the second one, as you can probably guess, is this information doesn't matter to me. Then the last one is, I don't know if this information matters to me. The important takeaway from this is, any information that is categorized rightly or wrongly as it doesn't matter to me is then just discarded from that person's gray matter, and it's no longer filtered. It's not there to be used for any further decision making or leadership or management. So it is extremely critical that as managers, you make particularly critical information matter to those high leverage staff and decision makers. This active filtering is not a conscious effort. We are all doing it all the time. You're doing it right now. You're deciding if what I'm telling you, either in whole or in part, if the information you're getting from me, if it matters to you, in which case you will continue listening, watching. Or if it doesn't matter to you, in which case you're going to turn me off. You're going to move on to a different workshop, realizing that this isn't what you expected, and it's of no use to you right now. Or you may decide that you don't know yet what to kind of do with it, in which case you'll continue most likely to watch and listen, but maybe a little bit skeptically, or maybe even a little bit frustrated because you haven't quite got enough information yet to make enough sense of what I'm saying. But in any case, you're making those decisions right now. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to manage that and manage the information flow and information management of those key high leverage decision makers. So the information that does get through, that information categorized as it matters or I don't know, is further filtered then through what is represented in our model then as the driver's eyes. So all the information got through the windshield is now perceived by the driver through his or her eyes. And that represents the total values filter. Again, using Dr. Glasser's terminology. And that values filter is a deeper analysis of the information based on what that person has maybe seen elsewhere in the industry, what they've been told by peers, what they've been told by managers, what they've just experienced and used to formulate what might be described as a professional moral compass. That is that deeper level of filtration. And that moral compass then is going to determine what they ultimately do with that information and how they act on it. So again, it's important to know that and to actively manage those factors that might define that individual's professional moral compass. So number 5 then, if you look kind of beyond the windshield, you look out at what the driver's looking at. There's an orb out there as number 5. That's what Dr. Glasser calls the perceived world. It's what that driver, that staff person is looking at. And again, it's a perceived world. So the things we've talked about so far have created what that driver is seeing. And of course, we can expect that pretty much most staff and employees in a similar position, doing similar things, are going to have a similar professional perception. But there is nuance to it, and we need to understand that as well. From person to person, what they're actually seeing in their professional experience isn't necessarily exactly the same. If we carry that through to number 6, that orb out there beyond number 5, that is, again, Dr. Glasser's term of, he uses quality world to describe general psychology. And I've coined this the professional quality world in this context, this application. So the quality world is what the person wants to see. And again, that's that person's expectation of what they should see based on all these things we've already talked about. What they've been told, what they've heard, what their job description said, what their manager has said. It's no accident in this model, however, that the perceived world, what that person is actually looking at, blocks their quality world. So this is the crux of this model. We're getting to kind of the takeaway nugget here. If the perceived world and the quality world are not closely aligned, you have a unmotivated, disaffected, disengaged staff person. You have a subacute risk factor. And the more responsibility that person has within your enterprise, the greater potential subacute risk factor that person is, because they're going to have influence over others. On the other hand, if what they want to see and what they actually see or what they actually perceive are closely aligned, then you have a happy, successful person who is getting those primary needs met. They're getting power needs met, freedom needs met, etc. They're achieving, they're sensing mastery, and they are generally happy in their work. That's the takeaway nugget. We want to get to a point of stasis within the management of those key staff people and those high leverage people. And to do that is management of that person's expectations and the reality of what they're actually going to see. And that will be a running theme throughout the module as well. Managing expectations versus reality. Then the last component here, number 7, is baggage, and that's represented by the trunk or the boot of the vehicle. And that baggage is that potential internal or external threat to that person's professional motivation and professional behavior that can come internally, externally, that we also need to recognize and manage. But regardless of what that person's baggage may be, and again, we all have it because we're humans before we are employees, it's none of your business what that person's baggage is. That is until they make it your business. That staff person signed a contract, signed a job description, or otherwise committed to a certain scope of work, a scope of responsibility for specific compensation. So they're not doing you a favor by showing up. They're getting paid. They're getting benefits package. They're getting whatever they're getting. And they've agreed to that. And that agreement does not carry with it any clauses within that contract that say, unless you have car trouble, or unless you can't find childcare, unless your coworkers don't like you or you don't like them, unless you think your boss is a jerk, unless you have marital problems, those things exist, but they don't exempt that individual from fulfilling their scope of responsibility. At the point at which it starts impacting on that person's job, it needs to be recognized and it needs to be managed. Because if it's not, if that person or persons are kind of allowed to just bring external threats into their work life, their work is going to suffer. But if that's allowed to go on, then that may just become the new standard. That may become kind of the new staff culture. And then at some point, you're going to have to put the hammer down. And when you do, that person who you finally said, no more, and in some regard, you called out that person, even though the intent may have been just to reset the standards back to where they're supposed to be, to that person, it's punitive. They've seen everybody else get away with it, and now they are not. So you have created a disengaged, disincentivized, unmotivated, potentially resentful person. And again, if that's a key staff, high leverage person, you have a greater subacute risk factor because they're going to have influence on others. So it's really important to recognize that we are humans first, but at the same time, get on top of and tactfully and actively manage those external threats. So the outcomes here of this model are, first, that all of us are humans before we are employees, and experienced, astute management considers and actively manages the human factor. And secondly, key staff, high leverage staff, employees, or clients are all looking for stasis in their professional lives. And that stasis is the intentional result of skillful management of perception, expectations, and professional reality.